the first time Eva Covington fired a rifle at a man. She was 19 years old, and she missed him on purpose, just to watch him run. That was the story people told in Dry Fork, Texas, in the summer of 1882, and they told it with the particular breathless mixture of admiration and outrage that always surrounded Eva Covington's name. She had grown up in that town the way a wildfire grows, consuming everything in its path not out of malice, but out of pure, relentless nature. She was the daughter of a cattle rancher who had died too early, leaving her his land, his debts, and his stubbornness in equal measure. She had buried her father when she was 17, signed the bank papers alone when she was 18, and turned the Covington ranch from a failing operation into a respectable one through sheer refusal to accept the outcome that everyone else had already decided for her. The men of Dry Fork had tried, in their various ways, to absorb her into the natural order of things. There had been Clement Prout, who had offered to buy the ranch at a price so insultingly low that Eva had laughed in his face in the middle of the general store, while half the town watched. There had been Harlan Wykes, who had courted her with all the enthusiasm of a man who believed that showing up constituted a romantic gesture, and who had proposed marriage over a plate of beans at her kitchen table as if he were making a land offer, and who had received a refusal so thorough and so specific in its reasoning that he had moved to Abilene 3 months later. There had been the banker, Mr. Doss, who had tried twice to pressure her into selling by manipulating the terms of her father's loan, and who had discovered that Eva Covington had read every word of every document before she signed it, and could recite the specific clauses back to him with the accuracy of a judge. People said she was ungovernable. They said it the way you say a river is ungovernable, not entirely as a criticism, but with the implication that something ungovernable is also something dangerous, something that needs to be managed before it causes a flood. The women of the town said it with pursed lips and a sympathy that was really just judgment wearing a softer coat. The men said it with a frustration that had curdled over the years into a kind of wary respect that they would never have admitted aloud. The children said it with pure delight, because to the children of Dry Fork, Eva Covington was the most interesting person in 50 miles. She rode like she had been born in the saddle, which she nearly had been. She could repair a fence line faster than any 2 men on her payroll. She read books ordered from a catalog in St. Louis, real books with ideas in them, not just almanacs and scripture, and she was not embarrassed about it. She wore her dark hair in a braid down her back because she had no time for elaborate arrangements and no patience for the pretense that she did. Her eyes were a particular shade of brown that in certain light looked almost amber, and they held a quality that made people feel, when she looked at them directly, that she was reading something behind their face that they hadn't intended to show her. She was, by the summer of 1882, 21 years old, and she was tired in a way she would not have admitted to anyone. Not tired of the work, never that. She loved the land with a ferocity that was almost religious, loved the smell of it after rain, loved the specific quality of the light over the low hills to the west in the evening. But she was tired of the constant negotiation of simply existing as herself. Tired of the way every conversation was a small battle, every transaction an opportunity for someone to try to take something from her. Tired of being alone with the weight of all of it, though she would have swallowed her own tongue before she said so. Wallace Hale arrived in Dry Fork on a Tuesday morning in late July, and he arrived the way a man arrives when he is not trying to make an entrance, which meant, inevitably, that he made one. He rode in on a dun mare that was dusty from the road but well cared for in the ways that mattered, with good hooves and clear eyes, and a coat that had been brushed recently, which told Eva something about him before he had said a word. She saw him first from the porch of Hennessy's general store, where she had gone to collect a supply order, and she watched him tie his horse at the post in front of the sheriff's office with the easy competence of someone who had been doing such things for a long time. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate adequately rather than well, with a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that suggested age without quite declaring it. He was perhaps 26 or 27, she guessed. He wore a hat that had been through considerable weather and a coat that had started its life as something better than what it currently was. He carried a rifle in a saddle scabbard and a pistol at his hip, which meant nothing particular in 1882 Texas, where every man carried something. What distinguished him, she noted, was the absence of the swaggering self-consciousness that most men carried along with their weapons. He looked like someone who had forgotten he was wearing them. He disappeared into the sheriff's office, and Eva collected her supply order and drove her wagon back to the ranch, and she did not think about him again, or so she told herself. What she told herself and what was true were, in this particular case, slightly different things. She heard about him that evening at the post office, where Mabel Crenshaw, who served as the town's primary news distribution system, informed Eva that the new arrival was named Wallace Hale, that he was from Amarillo originally, that he had apparently served as a livestock inspector for the county and was looking for work in the area, and that Sheriff Aldridge had apparently spoken well of him. He seemed polite, Mabel offered, which was about the highest compliment she dispensed. Eva thanked her and went home. 3 days later, Wallace Hale rode up to the gate of the Covington ranch. Eva was at the fence line nearest the road, working on a post that had loosened after a night of rain, and she heard him coming before she saw him. She finished driving the post before she turned around, because the post needed finishing, and because she was not in the habit of dropping what she was doing for anyone. "Miss Covington," he said, which surprised her slightly. Most men who came to her ranch said Mrs. Covington out of an assumption they never bothered to examine, or they said Miss with a condescension that turned the word into something smaller than a name. He said it the way you said someone's name when you already knew who they were and were simply confirming it. "That's right," she said and waited. "My name is Wallace Hale. I've been speaking with some of the ranchers in the area about taking on work as a livestock inspector. I understand you run a cattle operation here." "I do." He did not shift in the saddle. He did not look at the ranch house and estimate its value or look at her and try to determine what category she belonged in. He looked at her the same way he had looked at the fence post he must have noticed her working on, with a straightforward attention that seemed to take things as they were rather than as he expected them to be. "I've heard you run a tight operation," he said. "I also heard you've had some trouble this past spring with tick fever moving through the eastern herds." She had. It had cost her 14 head and 6 weeks of work she couldn't afford to lose. "Word travels," she said. "It does. I know tick fever. I know the patterns it follows, and I know what you need to watch for to catch it before it spreads. I'm not looking for charity work, Miss Covington. I'm looking to be useful, and I thought your operation might need someone who knows cattle medicine." Eva looked at him for a long moment. She had heard enough propositions and offers in her life to have developed a fairly reliable sense for the ones that were really about something else, the ones that were really about the land, or about the idea of her, or about some calculation that had nothing to do with livestock. She could not find that thing in his face. "What do you charge?" she asked. He named a figure. It was fair. Not insultingly low, which would have suggested he thought she could be maneuvered, and not high, which would have suggested he thought she was easy. It was just fair. "Come back Thursday," she said. "I'll show you the herd and you can tell me what you see." He nodded and turned his horse back toward the road without ceremony, and Eva watched him go and thought that he was either exactly what he appeared to be or considerably more complicated, and she was not yet sure which. He came on Thursday. She walked him through the south pasture first, where the main herd was grazing, and she watched him the way she watched everyone who came onto her land, with the particular quality of attention that takes stock of what a person notices and what they ignore. He moved through the cattle the way a good horseman moves, slowly and without sharp gestures, and he looked at the animals with a professional focus that she recognized and respected. He crouched to examine the legs of a heifer that had been limping slightly for a week, asked Eva 2 precise questions about the animal's grazing patterns and water source, and gave her a diagnosis that matched what she had already suspected but hadn't been certain enough to act on. "You should separate her from the others for a few days," he said. "That's not tick fever, that's a cut that's gotten a little infected. I can show your hand what to treat it with." "I know what to treat it with," Eva said. He looked up from the heifer's leg and met her eyes. There was a brief pause, and then something happened in his expression that she had not expected, not embarrassment and not defensiveness, but something that looked very much like genuine appreciation. "I expect you do," he said simply. It was such a small thing. It was so minor, so passing, so unremarkable in its construction, and yet something about it lodged in her chest in a way she did not immediately know what to do with. He had not apologized. He had not explained himself or backtracked into excessive reassurance. He had simply looked at what was evident, that she was a woman who ran her own ranch and knew her own cattle, and acknowledged it as a fact. She hired him. The arrangement was straightforward. He would ride out 3 mornings a week to check the herd, and if any animals needed treatment, he would handle it and charge for the supplies separately at cost. He was staying in the town at the boarding house run by Mrs. Fellmore, and he was picking up other work around the county on the days he wasn't at the Covington ranch. Over the first 2 weeks, their interactions were almost entirely professional. He reported what he found. She asked questions when she had them, and he answered them without the slight shortening of patience that she had learned to expect when women asked questions in contexts that men had decided were theirs alone. On a morning when she caught herself running through, in her head, 3 separate questions she wanted to ask about the immunization protocols that some ranchers were beginning to try, she realized that she had been looking forward to his visits and felt a quick flash of irritation at herself for it. She asked the questions anyway. He answered all 3 thoroughly, and then he asked her a question in return about her fencing approach, which she answered. And then they stood at the pasture fence and talked about cattle for another 40 minutes. And when he finally said he needed to get to the Grantley operation on the north side of town, Eva Covington stood at her fence for a full 2 minutes after he rode away before she went back to her own work. His name she discovered in pieces over those first weeks, the way you discover a landscape you are traveling through slowly. He had grown up in Amarillo, the middle of 3 brothers, with a father who had run a small horse-breaking operation and a mother who had died when he was 12. He had worked livestock in various capacities since he was 14, had spent 3 years as a deputy in a county she'd never heard of up north before deciding that enforcing law was not the work he wanted to be doing with his life. He had come south partly for work, and partly because the county he'd been in had become crowded with memories that weren't pleasant ones, and he had said this last part in the direct, unembroidered way he said most things, not seeking sympathy and not avoiding the truth. "What kind of memories?" Eva asked. They were at her kitchen table. She had offered him coffee one morning after a long session checking the north herd, and the coffee had turned into a longer conversation than either of them had quite planned. "I was engaged," he said. 2 years ago, she died of fever. It was fast, the way those things sometimes are." Eva was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it in the full, clean way that the words sometimes carry. "It was hard for a good while," he said. "It's less hard now." "Not gone, but less." She nodded and did not fill the space with unnecessary noise, which was, she suspected, exactly what he needed. He looked at her across the table with that particular quality of attention he had, the quality that made her feel seen rather than observed, and she thought that grief had done something to him that was not entirely a diminishment. It had pressed out whatever superficiality might have been there and left something that was harder and quieter and more real. "Your father built this place," he said, looking around the kitchen. "I heard that from someone in town. He started it. I've added to it." "What did you add?" She told him about the irrigation work she'd done 2 summers ago. about the feed rotation she'd developed with the help of a book she'd ordered from St. Louis, about the decisions she'd made that were different from her father's approach. She told him these things matter-of-factly, the way she discussed them in her own head, without the apologetic hedging she found herself performing for most people without meaning to. He listened with the focused, uninterrupted quality he brought to everything, and asked the kinds of questions that told her he was actually thinking about what she said. That irrigation change was the right call, he said, when she had finished. You'd have lost more to drought this summer without it. I know, she said, that slight curve at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile but its first cousin. I expect you do, he said again, and this time there was something else in it, a warmth that hadn't quite been there the first time he'd said those words, a familiarity just beginning to form at the edges. In August, there was a meeting of the ranchers of the surrounding area at the town hall in Dry Fork, concerning the question of whether to hire additional range riders to deal with the problem of cattle theft that had increased through the summer. Cattle theft was a real and serious concern in 1882 Texas, where the open range still bled into the more settled cattle country, and where the law was thin and the distances between properties large. Eva attended these meetings as a matter of course, as she attended all meetings that concerned her interests, and she attended them with the understanding that she would have to work harder than the men in the room simply to be heard. She arrived to find the hall already three-quarters full of ranchers, most of whom she knew by name, and many of whom she had dealt with in various capacities. She found a seat near the middle and set her hat on the bench beside her and waited for the meeting to begin. Wallace Hale was there, sitting toward the back, which surprised her slightly. He was not a rancher and the meeting was for ranchers. She registered his presence and looked away before he could catch her looking, which was perhaps the first genuinely adolescent thing she had done in at least 2 years. The meeting was the usual kind, contentious in the way. All meetings were where money and responsibility were being divided. There were men who wanted to hire riders at collective expense, and men who felt their individual operations were adequate, and there were men whose real objection was the cost but who dressed it up as a philosophical stance on independence. Eva had 2 specific points she wanted to make about patrol patterns and communication, and she waited for the right moment to make them. The right moment was closing at a speed she wasn't anticipating, as 2 of the ranchers, Clement Prout among them, because there was always a Clement Prout in any room, seemed to be driving the conversation toward a conclusion before she had spoken. She stood up. The room did not exactly fall silent, but it adjusted, the way a room adjusts when something unexpected happens. There's a pattern to the theft that nobody here has mentioned, she said, and she said it in the clear, carrying voice she had developed for exactly these occasions, the voice that did not ask permission to be heard because it had stopped asking for that several years ago. The cattle that have been taken have all come from properties that share a specific section of open range along the Eastern Creek. If you're hiring range riders, and you should, they need to be concentrated there during the hours between 10 at night and 3 in the morning, because that's when 3 of the 4 confirmed thefts have happened. There was a pause. Several of the men looked at each other in the particular way that men in that era looked at each other when a woman had said something correct that they had not said first. "How do you know when the thefts happened?" asked one of them. "Because I asked the owners when they noticed them missing and worked backward from there," Eva said, with a patience that was only barely patient. "It's not complicated." The meeting eventually reached a conclusion that included her suggestion, though the conclusion was technically reached by Cornelius Brand, who had been ranching for 30 years and who rephrased her idea in his own words 10 minutes after she had said it. Eva noted this and said nothing because noting it was enough. After the meeting, she was outside gathering her horse when she heard Wallace Hale's voice behind her. "That was right," he said. "What you said about the patrol times." She turned. He was standing at a polite distance, hat in his hand the way men held their hats when they were actually being respectful rather than performing it. It was obvious, she said. To you, apparently, he said. She looked at him for a moment. The evening light was doing something interesting, making the dust in the air glow amber and turning the main street of Dry Fork into something almost beautiful. You're not a rancher, she said. Why were you at that meeting? Sheriff Aldridge asked me to be there. He wanted someone who could identify signs of organized theft versus opportunistic. I've seen both. What did you conclude? Organized, he said. There's a pattern, like you said. 2 or 3 men working together, probably not from this area. They'll move on when the pickings get thin. She studied him. The thoroughness of his assessment, the absence of territorial pride about having reached it independently. You should have said that at the meeting, she said. You said most of it, he said. I didn't see the point in repeating you. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that she felt the muscles in her face consider it. She put her hat on and gathered her reins. Thursday, she said. Thursday, he agreed. She rode home in the amber evening and thought about him with more concentration than she had intended to allow herself. The difficulty with thinking about Wallace Hale, Eva discovered as August moved toward September and September brought the first hints of cooler air, was that he resisted the categories she had developed over the years for thinking about men. There was the category of men who wanted something from her land, which was large and well-populated. There was the category of men who wanted something from the idea of her, from the story of the ungovernable woman, who found her interesting the way people found difficult country interesting, worth looking at from a distance, not worth actually crossing. There was the category of men who were genuinely kind but whose kindness came wrapped in assumptions about what she needed that she had not asked for and did not want. Wallace Hale did not fit into any of these. He came on his 3 mornings a week, and increasingly their conversation stretched past the professional and into the personal, not in the way that felt like encroachment, but in the way that felt like mutual territory being carefully and willingly shared. He told her about his brothers, one of whom was still in Amarillo running the horse operation, and one of whom had gone east to study medicine. She told him about her father, the fierce, difficult man who had built the ranch from nothing and who had loved her in the particular frustrated way of men who wanted daughters they could be proud of but didn't know what to do when they got one. He was proud, she said. He just didn't know how to say it to me. He'd say it to other people and I'd find out later. Does that make it better or worse? She thought about it honestly, the way he always seemed to invite her to think about things, not pushing toward an answer, just genuinely asking. Both, she said. It's better than not being proud. It's worse than having been told. He nodded slowly. My father was the same way. Easier to speak about us to strangers than to us directly. I think some men just, the love is real, but the language for it is missing. The language shouldn't be that hard, Eva said. No, he agreed. It shouldn't. And then they were looking at each other across her kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window, and something passed between them that neither of them named because it was too new and too real to be named yet. She began to notice things she had not previously noticed. The way he dismounted always in a single fluid motion, as if the horse and he had reached a long agreement. The seriousness with which he listened when she was talking, not the performed seriousness of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but the genuine article, the kind where you could tell he was actually tracking what you said, and not just the sound of your voice. The fact that he never once told her what she should do, never offered opinion where opinion had not been requested, never treated the space between a question and an answer as an opportunity to insert a correction. It was this last thing, she thought, that was most unusual. Most men in her experience treated conversation as a contest that required eventual victory. Wallace Hale seemed to treat it as something else, something more like she searched for the word and found it unexpectedly exploration. He was interested. He was genuinely, persistently interested in what she thought and how she thought it, and he showed this interest not through flattery, which she had never trusted, but through the quality and the content of his attention. One afternoon in mid-September, they rode the fence line of the eastern pasture together, checking for the gaps that autumn storms sometimes created. And they were deep in a conversation about water rights, a pressing political issue in the Texas of 1882, as ranchers and new settlers fought bitterly over the management of rivers and creeks, when her horse stepped in a hidden hole and stumbled. Eva corrected automatically, with the effortless instinct of a lifetime of riding, and the horse recovered without incident. But Wallace was close enough that he had reached out by reflex, one hand extended toward her arm, before the situation resolved itself. He withdrew the hand. He said nothing about it because there was nothing to say. She had not needed the help and they both knew it. But she had felt the gesture, the instinctive reaching out, and it stayed with her the rest of the afternoon in a way she was not sure what to do with. Not because it had been patronizing, it hadn't. It had been the same reflex anyone has when someone beside them stumbles, but because of what it revealed. He had been paying that close of attention. He had been that present. That evening, sitting on the porch of the ranch house with the sun going down behind the western hills and the air smelling of coming autumn, Eva allowed herself to consider, for the first time fully and directly, that she was developing feelings for Wallace Hale that went beyond professional regard. She considered it the way she considered everything that frightened her a little head-on, with her eyes open, taking inventory. What she found was more than she had expected. She liked him. She liked him in the deep, specific way that is different from finding someone agreeable or interesting. She liked the particular shape of the way he moved through the world, the quiet steadiness of it. She liked his humor, which was dry and infrequent, and therefore worth something when it appeared. She liked the way he talked about his grief, not performing it and not hiding it. She liked that he had looked at her on that first day at the fence post and seen a woman running her own ranch and had just accepted it, without ceremony, as the plain fact it was. The fear was also there to be inventoried, and she was honest enough to look at it. She was afraid of what it would mean to let someone close, because everyone who had gotten close had eventually wanted to change something about her. Not maliciously, maybe not even consciously, but with the persistent small pressure of people who believe that a woman managing alone is a problem to be solved rather than a life to be respected. She was afraid of losing what she had built, not just the ranch but the self she had built alongside it, the particular freedom of being accountable only to herself. And underneath that fear, deeper and harder to look at, was the fear that she wanted this. That she wanted it enough that the wanting made her vulnerable, and she had not been vulnerable in 4 years and had not missed it. She sat with all of this as the light faded and the stars came out over Texas, clear and abundant the way they are in country that is still mostly dark at night, and she thought, I will let it be what it is and not decide in advance what that is. She was, as she had always been, a practical woman. In the last week of September, a man named Deke Callahan rode onto her property in the early morning while Wallace was there checking the herd, and Callahan was a man Eva knew by reputation, and by the one previous encounter she had had with him, which had ended with him leaving her land considerably faster than he had arrived on it. Callahan worked for Clement Prout. He was the instrument through which Prout conducted negotiations that Prout himself did not want to be associated with, which was a polite way of saying he was a man who made things difficult for people until they sold what Prout wanted to buy. He had 3 men with him, which was 2 more than he had brought last time, and Eva was alone at the fence when he arrived, which was why she had her rifle with her before he had finished his greeting. "Miss Covington," he said, with the elaborate courtesy of a man who considers courtesy a weapon. "Mr. Prout asked me to stop by again about that south parcel. He's prepared to offer more than his last figure." "The south parcel is not for sale," Eva said. The rifle was not pointed at anyone. It was just present, the way her own authority was present, not brandished, but not hidden either. "Mr. Prout thought perhaps you'd had more time to consider your situation." "My situation is that the south parcel is not for sale," she said. "Same as last time. Same as it will be next time if there is a next time." Callahan shifted his horse slightly, and the three men behind him shifted with him, and Eva felt the calculation happening, the way you feel weather changing before you can see it. She had been in this calculation before, and she knew how it resolved badly unless you changed the variables. She said, "It's not for sale." Wallace Hale's voice came from her left. He had come around the corner of the barn on foot, and he was standing at a distance that was neither close enough to be theatrical nor far enough to be irrelevant, and he was looking at Callahan with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely without ambiguity. Callahan looked at him with the assessing look of a man who was deciding whether the new variable was significant. "This isn't your business," he said. "I'm working on this property," Wallace said, without raising his voice, "which makes what happens on this property my business." There was a pause. Eva had the rifle and Wallace had his pistol still holstered, which was both a disadvantage and, in a way, a statement. 4 of them against 2, but the 2 were not uncertain, and Callahan was experienced enough to know that uncertain people were the ones worth pressing. "Mr. Pruitt is a patient man," Callahan said finally, turning back to Eva. "He'll ask again." "He can ask from Dry Fork," Eva said. "You're done here." They left. Not fast, not running. These were not men who ran, but they left, and Eva watched them go with the rifle resting in the crook of her arm until they were through the gate. She lowered the rifle and turned to find Wallace still standing where he had been, watching the retreating riders with an expression that had not changed. "Pruitt's been after that parcel for 2 years, she said. "I know, people in town talk about it." He looked at her. "You handled it." "I was handling it," she said, and heard the slight edge in her voice and adjusted it because it was not him she was directing it at. "Thank you for being there." He nodded once, accepting the thanks the way he accepted most things, without deflection and without making more of it than it was. "Is there a legal issue I should know about, with the deed?" "No, the deed is clear and it is mine." Pruitt just doesn't believe that a property deed in a woman's name means what it means. Wallace was quiet for a moment. "He's going to keep sending people." "He is," she agreed. "Then we should make sure Sheriff Aldridge knows there's a pattern of harassment." She looked at him, registering the "we." He did not seem to have noticed he had said it. "I'll speak to Aldridge tomorrow," she said. She did, and Sheriff Aldridge, who was a decent man doing his best in a county that gave him limited tools, took a formal statement from her and sent a message to Pruitt that further visits to the Covington property would be treated as trespass. Pruitt backed off, at least for a while, and Eva filed the incident away as resolved but not concluded, the way you file things that will come back in a different form. What she could not file away as easily was the image of Wallace Hale coming around that corner of the barn and standing in that particular posture, not aggressive, not performing heroism, but simply present, simply alongside her, adding himself to the equation without trying to take it over. That evening she wrote in the journal she had kept since she was 14, the private one that she kept locked in her father's old desk, and she wrote, "I think I have been wrong about what it would feel like to want to let someone close. I thought it would feel like surrender. It does not feel like that. The first time they were together in the evening was not planned." It was early October, the air finally carrying the real coolness of autumn after the long, brutal summer, and Eva had been working since before dawn on a problem with the well pump that had kept her, and 2 of her ranch hands occupied all day. By the time the pump was working again, and the hands had gone home to their own families, and the sun was going down, she was tired in the bone-deep way that comes from real work, the satisfying kind of tired that carries its own comfort. Wallace had been there for the last 2 hours of the pump repair, having ridden over for his scheduled afternoon visit, and found the situation, and simply stayed and helped, not taking charge of it, but adding 2 more hands to a problem that benefited from 4. He was, she had noticed, good with his hands in the specific way of someone who had learned to fix things out of necessity rather than inclination, without fuss or ceremony. When the pump was running and they had washed up at the trough and the ranch had gone quiet around them, Eva said, without particularly planning to, "You should eat before you ride back. It's late." He looked at her. The last light of the day was behind him. "If it's not trouble," he said. "It wouldn't be," she said, and went inside. She made a simple meal: beans and cornbread and salt pork, the kind of meal that was real food without pretension. And they ate at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them. And the conversation moved the way it always moved when they were together, easily, across ground that felt both new and, somehow, familiar. He asked her what she had read most recently. She had been reading a collection of essays by John Muir, naturalist writing, that was beginning to appear in Eastern magazines, and that described the American landscape with a reverence that matched something in her own experience of the land, though she would not have had the language for it that Muir did. "He writes about the mountains as if they are alive in a way that isn't just metaphor," she said. "As if the land has a kind of experience of its own that we don't fully understand. Do you think that's true?" "I think something like that is true," she said. "I don't know if I'd put it the way he does. But when I'm out on this land in the early morning before anyone else is moving, there's something there, some quality of it that isn't nothing." He was quiet, considering. "I know what you mean," he said. "I've felt that in mountains and felt it in open range and felt it sometimes in a good storm, like the world is larger and more itself than we usually notice." She looked at him across the lamplight. She thought, this is what it would be. This, the easy movement of his mind alongside mine. The ability to say a thing that is half-formed, and have it met with recognition instead of confusion. They sat for another hour after the meal, and when he finally rose to go, because the hour was late and the ride back to town was not short, there was a moment at the door that was charged with something that neither of them acted on, a moment of slight suspension, as if time were briefly offering them an opportunity to say something true. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he said. And then, quieter, "This was good, Eva." It was the first time he had used her given name. She held the door frame and felt it land in her chest. "It was," she said. He rode away into the dark and she stood in the doorway for a long moment before going back inside. October moved forward and the quality of their time together was changing, had been changing for weeks, accumulating small moments the way a river accumulates small tributaries, each one minor in itself, the whole thing powerful. She caught herself tracking the days between his visits. She caught herself dressing with slightly more care on mornings he was coming, and then caught herself noticing that she was doing this, and felt a combination of amusement and exasperation at herself that was probably the most honest thing she had felt in months. He brought her a book one Tuesday, not a scheduled day for him to be there, riding up the lane with a casual air that did not quite mask the slight self-consciousness behind it. "I came across this at the post office," he said. "Someone had ordered it and never collected it. Henderson said it was going to sit there until it went to waste. It seemed like something you'd want." It was a natural history of the Texas Hill Country, fairly recent publication, the kind of thing she did want and would have ordered eventually. She took it and looked up at him, and he was looking at her with an expression that was new to her, not the calm attention she was used to, but something quieter and slightly less composed, something that felt to her like a man standing at the edge of something. "Thank you," she said. "I wasn't sure if it would be an imposition," he said, which was, for him, an unusual kind of uncertainty, and she found it somehow more affecting than any confidence could have been. "It's not an imposition," she said. He stayed the morning. They walked the north pasture and talked about the book, and talked about the hill country and talked about water and grass and what the winter might bring, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, his hand brushed hers as they walked, and neither of them moved away. They walked the rest of the morning with their hands occasionally close but not touching again, both of them fully aware of the other's proximity in a way that was like a low, clear note being held somewhere below the conversation, present without being named. She thought, on the walk back, that she was going to have to say something. She was not a woman who waited for things to happen to her. She had never been that woman, and she did not intend to start being her now. But she was also navigating something new here, something she had not navigated before, and she was moving carefully the way you move carefully in country you love and do not want to damage. 2 days later, he found her in the barn working on a harness that had broken, the kind of meticulous leather work that took time and good light and patience, and she was so absorbed in it that she did not hear him come in. She looked up and found him leaning in the doorway, watching her with that expression again, the one that was quieter than his usual calm. "You do that with your whole self," he said. "Do what?" "Everything you do it with your whole self. I don't think I've ever seen you do anything halfway." She set the harness down. She looked at him across the sunlit barn. "Most things aren't worth doing halfway," she said. "No," he said. He straightened from the doorway and took a step into the barn. "Eva, I need to say something." Her heart was doing something she would have criticized in anyone else. She kept her face where she wanted it, open and steady. "Say it then," she said. He took another step. He was serious in the way that went all the way down. The way that meant what he was about to say was not something he had dressed up or practiced, but something he was saying directly from wherever it actually lived. "I came here to work," he said. "I came here because you had a cattle operation that needed someone with my specific knowledge, and it was a fair arrangement. I want to be clear that my being here started with that, and nothing about what I feel now has changed the respect I have for everything you've built and everything you are outside of anything to do with me." She was very still. "But I feel something for you that has gotten to the point where not saying it feels dishonest," he said. "And I don't know what to do with it because I think I understand that you've had to fight to keep your life your own, and the last thing I want is to be one more person who turns up wanting to take it over. I know you're not that," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "I want you to know it too," he said. "I'm not here to govern you. I have never had any interest in governing you. I came to know you. And what I've found in knowing you is," he paused, with the slight pause of a man reaching for accuracy rather than eloquence, "more than I knew how to want." The barn was very quiet. Outside, one of the horses shifted and blew. The light came through the high window at an angle that caught the dust in the air and made it luminous. Eva Covington put down the harness in her hands and stood up and crossed the space between them, and she put her hand against his jaw the way she did things without ceremony, with her whole self, and she kissed him. He was still for one moment in the way of someone absorbing something that is better than they had allowed themselves to fully imagine, and then he kissed her back, one hand coming up to rest at the back of her head, gentle and certain, and it was nothing like she had thought it might be. It was quieter than she had expected and more complete. When she stepped back, she was aware of her own heart, the traitorous loudness of it. "I was going to say something eloquent," she said. "That was better than eloquent," he said. She laughed. It was sudden and genuine, the kind of laugh that comes when something releases, and he smiled, the full thing, not the almost smile she had been seeing for months, and it changed his face in a way that made something ache pleasantly in her chest. "I need to finish the harness," she said. "I know," he said, and stepped aside, and sat on a hay bale and watched her finish it with the attention he brought to all things. And she worked with her whole self the way he had said she did, and the afternoon was somehow the most ordinary and the most extraordinary afternoon she had ever spent. The weeks that followed had a quality of discovery that Eva had not expected, not just of him, but of herself through him. She discovered that she was capable of more softness than she had thought, not the performed softness that women in 1882 were expected to maintain, but the real kind, the kind that costs something because it's genuine. She discovered that it was possible to share the weight of things without losing the weight itself, without the diminishment she had always feared from relying on another person. When she told him about the difficulty of the spring, the tick fever and the financial pressure, and the nights she had sat with the books trying to make numbers cooperate with her will, she did not feel smaller for having said it. She felt more accurately known, and she saw, as she watched him through October and into November, what he was when he was himself, what he was when he was not performing or managing but simply being. He was kind in a way that was specific rather than general, attentive to particular people and particular situations, rather than dispersing it evenly like weather. He was patient with difficulty without being passive about it. He had strong opinions that he held clearly without using them as a way to dismiss other people's. He was, she concluded, a genuinely good man, which was something she had been careful not to expect from anyone for a long time. One evening in early November, they rode out to the far edge of the north pasture together, to the place where the land began to rise slightly toward the low hills, and they sat their horses in the cooling air and watched the sun go down over Texas. The sky turned orange and then pink and then the particular deep blue that precedes the dark, and the first stars appeared, and Eva was aware of him beside her with a completeness that felt like something settling rather than something new. "I want to say something," she said. "Say it then," he said, using her own words back to her gently. "I have not been easy," she said. "Not for anyone and not for myself. I have not been easy to know. I know that about myself, and I do not intend to change it, because most of the difficulty of me is just the truth of me. But I want you to know that knowing you it's been the easiest thing I've done in 4 years. And I don't entirely know what to do with that." He was quiet for a long moment. The horses stood patient beneath them. A nighthawk moved through the darkening air. "I don't want easy in the way that means simple," he said. "I want it in the way it feels when something is exactly what it is. That's what this feels like to me." She looked at him, this quiet man on his good dun mare in the last of the Texas light, this man who had come to her gate with a fair price and a professional purpose and had become, through the patient accumulation of genuine attention, something else entirely. "Wallace," she said. "Eva," he said. They rode home in the dark together. November brought winter's first real intentions, cold mornings, frost on the grass before dawn, the particular quality of light that belongs to winter in Texas, pale and clear and shadowless. Eva's work changed with the season, the urgency of summer giving way to the slower, harder grind of keeping cattle alive through cold. She and Wallace fell into a rhythm that was beginning to feel like something built, something with foundations. He had been offered a permanent inspector position with the county, covering a broad territory, and he had taken it, which meant that his time at her ranch was more formal now. He was not working there exclusively, but it also meant he was staying in Dry Fork with some permanence, which she noticed she felt something specific and not small about. He was at her kitchen table on a Friday morning in late November, the smell of coffee filling the room, when he said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "I want to ask whether you would consider," he stopped, reorganized. "I want you to know first that I understand what this place means to you and what your independence means to you. What you've built here is yours, and I have no intention of ever treating it otherwise. But I want to ask whether you might consider at some point whether there's a shape to this that we both want." Eva looked at him across the table. She was not a woman who required ornament or ceremony. She was a woman who required honesty and specificity. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. He looked at her with that expression that was more complex than it appeared. "I'm working toward that," he said. "I want to be certain that asking it doesn't feel to you like someone trying to take something from you." "It doesn't," she said. "I know the difference between that and this." "Do you want to be married?" he asked, not assuming the answer, genuinely asking. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything honestly. She thought about the life she had and the life she was imagining. She thought about what it would mean to share the mornings and the evenings and the difficult decisions and the satisfying ones. She thought about what she was unwilling to give up and found that none of it was in conflict with the life she could see possible here. "Yes," she said. "With the understanding that this ranch is mine and my name stays on the deed." "It's your ranch," he said simply. "I never thought otherwise. And I will not become a different person because I'm someone's wife." "I don't want a different person," he said. "Eva, I want you, the exact version of you that exists right now." She felt something open in her chest, some long-held tightness releasing that she had not fully known was there. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Then yes," she said. He brought his other hand up and covered hers, and they sat there in the morning with the coffee and the winter light and the quiet enormity of what they had just decided, and it felt nothing like surrender. It felt, she thought, exactly like what it was, two people who had looked at each other clearly, without embellishment and without evasion, and chosen. They married in the second week of December in the small church in Dry Fork, with Sheriff Aldridge as one of the witnesses and Mrs. Fellmore as the other, and with a small gathering of people who ranged from genuinely happy for them to barely concealing their astonishment that anyone had successfully courted Eva Covington. Mabel Crenshaw, naturally, was there and would have material for months. Eva wore a dress she had ordered from a catalog, not the elaborate white of Eastern fashion, but a deep blue wool that was practical and warm and happened to be precisely the color that made her amber eyes striking, a fact she had noted without being particularly discomfited by it. She wore her hair down, which she almost never did, and the thickness of it and the particular way it fell made Wallace Hale, when he saw her walk into that church, lose the thread of the conversation he had been having mid-sentence. The ceremony was brief and honest. When the Reverend reached the part about obedience, which was standard in the marriage rite of that era, Eva caught Wallace's eye and he caught hers, and something passed between them that was the opposite of gravity. A shared, private recognition, almost a shared amusement, at the gap between the ceremonial language and the actual nature of this particular union. He promised to love, honor, and keep her, and she heard him mean every syllable of it. She promised the same, and she meant it the way she meant everything completely. Outside the church in the December air, she felt the ring on her hand, a plain silver band, nothing ornate, exactly as she had wanted, and felt the curious rightness of it, that a thing she had thought of for years as a potential diminishment had turned into something that felt only like an addition, something that had not subtracted a single thing from the self she had spent 4 years building, but had simply placed alongside it another thing that was good. Clement Prout did not attend the wedding, which surprised no one. What surprised people in the weeks and months that followed was how little changed, and how much changed simultaneously. The Covington ranch was still Eva's ranch. She still ran it with the same fierceness and attention that she always had. The deed remained in her name. The decisions remained hers. She and Wallace had discussed this before the wedding, and they held to what they had discussed, which was a more equitable arrangement than most marriages of 1882 could claim, and which they both took seriously. What changed was the quality of daily life, in ways that were large and small. There was someone to eat supper with and to talk with in the evenings, and to wake up next to in the mornings. There was someone who handed you the hammer when you were on the roof, and remembered what you had said 2 weeks ago about the problem with the eastern fence, and noticed when you were tired before you said so. There was someone who made the work half the weight, not by taking it from you, but by being alongside you in it. Prout made one more attempt in the spring, sending a lawyer this time rather than Callahan, which was either a sign of escalation or of Prout finally acknowledging that physical intimidation was not going to work. The lawyer was polite, and the offer was now actually reasonable, which was almost more annoying than the insulting ones had been. Eva declined it, clearly and on the record, and Wallace was present for the meeting and said almost nothing, and didn't need to. The lawyer saw the situation for what it was and reported back to Prout, and the approach did not come a third time. By the summer, Prout had apparently redirected his acquisitive intentions toward a property to the north that belonged to someone with less resolve, which Eva felt a flicker of guilt about, and then filed away as a problem that was not hers to solve. The summer of 1883 was good. Better than good, it was the kind of summer that, looking back later, you recognize as one of the ones you were living inside of prosperity without fully knowing it yet. The cattle operation had a strong season. The improvements Eva had made to the irrigation held through a particularly dry August and kept the south pasture producing when several neighboring ranches were struggling. Wallace's work with the county expanded his knowledge and his connections and his income, and they were comfortable in a way that was not extravagant but was genuinely solid. In the evenings they sat on the porch of the ranch house, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't, because they had reached the kind of familiarity where silence between them was not absence but presence, another form of company. She read, and he often read alongside her, the two of them in the falling dark with the land spread out before them and the stars coming on. She loved him. She loved him in the full, specific, unromantic, and deeply romantic way that is different from being in love, which is a condition, and more like loving, which is a practice, something you do with your whole self, every day choosing and choosing again. She loved the quietness of him and the humor of him and the way he looked at her. She loved that he had seen her clearly from the beginning and had not found anything to correct. He told her he loved her on an ordinary Wednesday morning when they were sitting on the porch before work, and he said it the way he said things, simply, without preface, as if it were a fact he was reporting. "I love you," he said. "I know I've shown it, I think, but I wanted to say it directly." She put her hand over his. "I know you do," she said. "I love you too." And that was that, as simply as anything true can be said. By the autumn of 1883, Eva realized she was pregnant. She sat with the knowledge for a few days, turning it over with the same thorough attention she gave to everything, feeling the layers of it. She had never been certain whether she wanted children. She had been too busy surviving her 20s to think carefully about it. Now, with the certainty of the new life settling into her body, she found that what she felt was something larger than she had expected. Something that was not diminishment and not fear, though both were also present in smaller portions. Something that was awe and a kind of fierce joy that felt continuous with the fierce joy she had always felt about the land. She told Wallace on a Friday evening in October, on the porch with the last of the day's light going out. He was still for a moment, the particular stillness of someone absorbing something large. And then he turned to look at her with an expression that she had never quite seen on his face before, not the steady attention she knew, not the quiet humor, not the grief-quieted depth. This was something open and full and moved, the face of a man encountering something that exceeded his own ability to manage it into composure. "Eva," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. "I know," she said. He took her hand and held it with both of his. He did not say anything else for a long time, and she did not need him to. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was difficult in the way that winters on the open range were often difficult, cold, that came hard and fast, storms that tested the fencing and the animals and the people managing them. Eva, who was not inclined to be managed under ordinary circumstances, was certainly not inclined to let pregnancy slow her work significantly, which led to a negotiation with Wallace that was conducted honestly on both sides. She was willing to let him take on more of the physical labor through the coldest months. He was willing to accept that she was the authority on her own body and her own limits. The negotiation reached a resolution that satisfied them both, which was about what you would expect from two people who had gotten good at talking to each other. She kept working. She kept making decisions. She sat up late with the account books and made the plans for the following year and ordered supplies and managed her ranch hands with the same competence she had always managed them. She was ungovernable. She had always been ungovernable. Pregnancy simply added a layer to the life she was already living, the way everything that had come to her did. Their son was born in the early morning of April 3rd, 1884, attended by the town's doctor and by Mrs. Fellmore, who had delivered a good portion of the county's children over the previous 2 decades, and whose composure under the circumstances was an enormous practical asset. They named him James, after Eva's father, not without complication, given that James Covington had been a man who had loved her and failed to say so, and whose fierce stubbornness she had inherited along with everything else. But a name is also an acknowledgement, and she wanted to acknowledge him. James Hale came into the world at considerable volume, and with an already apparent opinion about the proceedings, which Wallace observed from just outside the door with a mixture of terror and joy that Eva was told about afterward by Mrs. Fellmore, and which she considered the most accurate possible response to the situation. When they put the baby in her arms and she held him, she felt something that was not the same as anything she had ever felt before. Not larger than what she felt for Wallace exactly, but a different shape, a different room in the same large house. He was so small and so certain, his small face arranged with the absolute seriousness of the newborn, and she thought, "I would burn the world for you," and then immediately thought, "But I will not burn myself for you because you need a mother who is whole." She looked up and found Wallace in the doorway, and the look on his face undid her in a way she was only able to allow because she was already lying down and there was no dignity left to lose. "He's remarkable," Wallace said. "He's going to be trouble," she said. "He comes by it honestly," Wallace said. She laughed, which she immediately regretted and also did not regret at all. The years that followed were full in the way that the best lives are full, not without difficulty, but without emptiness. James grew into a child who was, as predicted, remarkable and also considerably challenging, with his mother's precise mind and his father's quiet patience and his own particular personality, which was apparently designed for the express purpose of investigating the physical limits of every structure and system in a 20-mile radius. He was curious and willful and startlingly perceptive, and Eva watched him with a love that was too large for her to fully contain, and also with a recognition that she found both amusing and profound. He was 4 years old when he informed a man at the general store who had condescended to his mother that she was the smartest person in the county and possibly the state, and he said it with the absolute factual confidence of a child who has observed the world carefully and reached a conclusion. Eva had turned away to hide the expression on her face, which was mainly pride and partly the effort not to agree too enthusiastically in public. Wallace was a father with the same quality he brought to everything: present, patient, attentive without hovering, teaching without lecturing. He taught James to sit a horse by the time James was 3, patiently, with the same ease and absence of force that characterized how he moved through the world. He taught him how to look at cattle and know what he was seeing. He read to him in the evenings with the same seriousness he brought to his own reading, and James, who could not yet read himself, listened with a focus that probably came from both sides of his parentage. The ranch expanded in 1886, when Eva negotiated the purchase of a parcel of land to the west of the main property, a piece she had had her eye on for 2 years, and which became available when its owner decided to leave Texas for California. She negotiated the price over 4 meetings that Wallace attended as her husband but did not drive, sitting quietly to one side while she conducted the deal, which he understood and respected as something that needed to be hers. When they signed the papers, he shook her hand formally, the way you shake the hand of someone who has just concluded something significant, and then he kissed her on the cheek in the lawyer's office, and the lawyer pretended not to notice, and Eva did not care if he did. Clement Prout, who had apparently also wanted that western parcel, heard about the sale and was said to have used language unfit for polite company when he learned who had bought it. Eva heard this from Mabel Crenshaw, who delivered the information with the restrained pleasure of a woman who had always privately found Prout insufferable. By the summer of 1887, the Covington Ranch, she had kept the name, and Wallace had not only accepted this but had agreed that it was right, that the name was the land's name, and the land's name should stay, was a prosperous and respected operation. Eva had acquired a reputation that had evolved over the years from ungovernable to something harder to dismiss, something closer to formidable, which she considered an accurate upgrade. She was known throughout the county and beginning to be known further as someone whose judgment about cattle and range management was worth consulting, and she had been asked twice to speak at meetings in the nearest large town, and had done so both times with the clarity and precision of someone who was used to being heard, and intended to stay that way. Wallace's work with the county had grown. He was now overseeing a team of inspectors and had developed a protocol for the prevention and management of tick fever that was being adopted more widely. And he had written up the approach in a technical document that had been published in a livestock journal, which he mentioned to Eva with the faint self-consciousness of a man who found his own accomplishments slightly embarrassing to discuss, and who was immediately told by his wife that self-effacement about good work was a waste of everyone's time and she was proud of him. "Say it again," he said. "I am proud of you," she said, with full sincerity and a slight roll of her eyes at his expression. "Don't make it into something to exploit." "I would never," he said, and was clearly lying. She laughed and loved him and went back to her account books. In the autumn of 1887, she was pregnant again. She received this news with the same combination of awe and fierce certainty that she had received it the first time, and with the added dimension of James, now 3, who was informed that a sibling was coming, and received this information with the suspicious consideration of a child calculating how the power dynamics of his world were about to shift. "Will it be a brother or a sister?" he asked, with great seriousness. "We don't know yet," Eva said. He considered this. "I would prefer a brother," he said, "but I would accept a sister." "That is very magnanimous of you," Wallace said. James looked at him with the expression of a 3-year-old who suspects he is being laughed at but cannot confirm it. The baby arrived in the early spring of 1888, a girl, and her name was Clara, which was the name of Eva's mother, who had died when Eva was young enough that she was more an idea than a memory, a woman known through other people's descriptions, and through the particular kind of loss that lives in your body rather than in your mind. Clara Hale was born with her father's dark eyes and her mother's clear opinion about the world, which became apparent approximately 15 minutes after her arrival. James, standing in the doorway of the room after being allowed in to see her, looked at his new sister with the evaluative expression he brought to all new information and said, "She seems quite loud." "She does," Wallace agreed. "She's perfect," Eva said, and meant it the way she meant everything. James allowed, over the following weeks, that he did not find a sister entirely without merit. The years between 1888 and 1892 were the years that Eva, looking back later, would identify as the ones that had contained the most of everything, the most work and the most growth, and the most of the particular texture of life that comes from being in the middle of building something. James started school in Dry Fork, and was the kind of student who made his teachers uncertain whether they were dealing with exceptional intelligence or exceptional stubbornness, which was fair. Clara showed, from earliest childhood, a quality of directness that her mother recognized and welcomed, and her father accepted with the philosophical equanimity of a man who had fallen in love with the original model. The ranch was thriving. The western expansion had proven to be the right decision, as Eva had known it would be, and the improved irrigation had held through 2 particularly difficult drought summers and kept the operation alive when several neighboring ranches had struggled. She employed a small team of hands who were loyal in the way that people are loyal when they are fairly paid and treated with respect, which Eva had always done as a matter of both principle and practicality. Wallace and she had reached, by this point, the deep familiarity of a marriage that had been genuinely chosen every day. She knew the exact quality of his silence that meant he was worried about something and had not yet said so. He knew the specific tightness in her jaw that meant she was tired, but intended not to mention it. They had learned each other the way you learn a landscape you love and return to, with the intimacy that comes only from time and attention and the willingness to keep looking. They still sat on the porch in the evenings. They still talked easily and were quiet easily. He still brought her books when he found them, and she still read them with her whole self. And sometimes she read passages aloud to him as he sat across from her in the lamplight, and he listened to everything she said with the same quality of attention he had brought to everything since the first day. In 1892, There was a severe winter storm that came in faster than predicted and caught the North herd out on the open range before they could be moved. The potential losses were significant, and Eva and Wallace and the ranch hands worked for 2 straight days in conditions that were genuinely dangerous, moving through the cold and the driving snow to push the cattle toward shelter. It was brutal and exhausting, and the children, staying warm with Mrs. Fellmore in the ranch house, came out on the second day to see their parents coming in from the field with ice in their hair and a successful resolution to the crisis. James, who was 8 by then, looked at his parents with an expression that contained a great deal and said nothing immediately. That night after supper, he came to find Eva in the kitchen and said, "Mother, is the ranch going to be mine someday?" Eva looked at him across the kitchen. He was serious, the way he was when something mattered to him. "It will be yours and your sister's," she said. "Both of you." He nodded slowly. "I'm going to learn to run it," he said. "I want to know all of it." "I know," she said. "I'll teach you. Will you teach Clara too?" "Of course," she said. "She'll probably teach herself before either of us gets to her." He considered this and found it accurate. "That's fair," he said. She put her hand on his shoulder and felt the growing solidity of him. This child who was becoming a person right in front of her, and felt the particular combination of loss and pride that is the texture of being a parent. Later that night, in the dark of the bedroom, with the winter wind against the windows and the warmth of the house around them, Eva lay with her head against Wallace's shoulder and said, "He asked about the ranch tonight." "I know," Wallace said. "He asked me last week if he could start riding the fence line with you." "He can," she said. "I told him you'd say that." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pressed at the house and the house held. "I think," she said, "that this is what I always wanted. I don't know that I knew it, but I think this is what it was." He pulled her slightly closer. "Tell me," he said. "All of it," she said. "The ranch and the work and the children and the hard winters and the good summers and you. I kept thinking for years that wanting this would mean losing something, and I lost nothing. I have all of what I had and all of this too." He was quiet for a long moment, the quiet that meant he was taking something in fully before responding to it. "You gave me that too," he said. "I came here having had things taken from me, and I didn't know how to want what I wanted anymore. You being with you taught me that wanting something is not the same as expecting to lose it." She tilted her face up toward him in the dark. "That is a considerable thing to say," she said. "I've been considering it for a while," he said. She kissed him in the dark, warm and slow, and he held her with the certainty of someone who has no intention of letting go. And the winter pressed at the house and the house held, and they were home. The summer of 1894 brought something that Eva had not anticipated: recognition from the county commissioner's office, in the form of a formal acknowledgement of the Covington Ranch's irrigation and management practices as a model for the region, accompanied by an invitation to participate in a regional conference on cattle management and water rights that would be held in October. She accepted, naturally. Wallace rode with her to the conference, which was held in the larger town of Meridian, where they stayed 2 nights in a hotel and attended sessions, and met other ranchers and livestock professionals from across the region. Eva spoke twice in the main sessions, and was listened to with the attention that had become, over the years, the ordinary response to her speaking, the attention of people who had learned that, when Eva Covington said something, it was worth hearing. She spoke about irrigation and about tick fever prevention, and about the financial management of a cattle operation in a state where water rights were increasingly contested. And she spoke with the precision and confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about and had no interest in pretending otherwise. Afterward, in the hotel lobby, a man whose name she didn't catch came up to Wallace and said, with the slight patronizing air of a man making a compliment he thought was large, "Your wife is quite something." Wallace looked at him with the calm, level attention he brought to all things. "She is," he said. "She always has been." Eva, who had heard, caught his eye across the lobby, and something passed between them that contained the whole arc of what they were to each other. The whole history of it, from the fence post to the barn to the kitchen table to the porch to the bed in the cold winter to this hotel lobby in 1894. And she smiled at him with all of it in the smile. He smiled back, and it was still the full thing, the smile that changed his face, and she was still glad of it. On the ride home from Meridian, through the October Hill country, with the leaves beginning their slow gold, they talked about the children and the winter plans and the new pasture management approach she was considering, and whether James's stubbornness was going to be the making of him or the death of everyone around him. And they laughed about the things that were funny and were serious about the things that required it. And the miles went by with the easy companionship of people who had learned to travel well together. They arrived back at the Covington ranch in the late afternoon to find James and Clara in the yard, Clara sitting on the fence with a book in her lap and James mid-argument with one of the hands about the proper technique for something that Eva assessed in a glance as not actually his call to make. She sorted this out efficiently and fairly, in the way she sorted most things, and James accepted the correction with the grace of a boy who had learned that his mother was almost always right, and that accepting this was, ultimately, less exhausting than resisting it. The house was warm and the supper was already started, and the lamps were lit against the falling dark, and Eva stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of it. The light and the warmth and the children and the man who had come off the road behind her and was washing his hands at the basin and speaking to James about the argument he'd been having, and felt the completeness of the life she had built, not the completion that means finished, but the wholeness that means nothing essential is missing. She had been called ungovernable by every person who had tried to govern her, and she had been right all along to resist them, because governing her had never been the point, had never been the thing that would make a life. What made a life was what she had: work that was real and land that was hers and children who were growing into themselves, and the man who had come to her gate and said plainly that he had not come to govern her, that he had come to know her. He had known her. He had gone on knowing her, year by year, the full and difficult and particular person she was, and she had known him in return. And this was what they had built together, not a version of her that someone else had approved, but the life she had always wanted before she had known what it was she was wanting. In the evenings that followed, and in all the evenings she could see ahead of her, she and Wallace sat on the porch of the ranch that bore her name and watched the Texas sky do what the Texas sky had always done, the extravagant theatrics of it. The sunsets and the stars and the weather moving across the open distance, and they were in it together, the two of them, in the way of people who have found the thing that is right and have held on to it with both hands. James, at 10 years old, was already learning the fence lines and asking the questions a future rancher asks, and Clara, at 6, had decided she intended to be a doctor, an ambition that Eva had heard and taken completely seriously and already begun to figure out how to support. There was time ahead, plenty of it, full of work and seasons and the particular pleasures of a life being fully lived, and none of it was in any way simple or guaranteed, because nothing real ever was. But it was hers. All of it was wholly, completely hers. And beside her on the porch in the falling dark, his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair, was the man who had always known that. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Good everything." She looked at him in the last of the light, this good quiet man, her partner and her love, the person who had looked at her with clear eyes from the very beginning and had never once tried to make her into something other than what she was. "The best kind," she said. The stars came out over Texas, clear and countless, and the night settled around the Covington ranch like something familiar and reliable, and they sat together in the dark that was not empty but full, and the land that was hers spread out in every direction, patient and alive, the way it had always been, the way it would go on being. And Eva Covington, who had been called ungovernable by everyone who had ever tried, sat in the evening of her extraordinary ordinary life and thought that they had all been exactly right, and that it had made all the difference.